August 1st, 1798. The sun dips low over the waters of Aboukir Bay off the coast of Egypt. The Mediterranean glows blood red in the fading light, as if foreshadowing the carnage to come. Here, destiny waits. Two fleets, two nations, and two of history's greatest commanders are about to collide in a struggle that will shape the fate of empires. The camera of our imagination sweeps across the bay. French ships anchored in tight formation, proud tricolors fluttering in the wind. Across the horizon, sails emerge, the relentless advance of the British Royal Navy under Horatio Nelson. This is not just another naval battle. This is the Battle of the Nile. In 1798, Europe burned with the fires of revolution and war. France, under the command of its rising star, General Napoleon Bonaparte, sought to dominate the continent. But Napoleon's ambition stretched beyond Europe. His eyes turned east to Egypt. Egypt was more than a prize of conquest. It was the gateway to the east, the lifeline of trade, the stepping stone to British India. If France could seize it, they could choke Britain's empire at its throat. In May 1798, Napoleon sailed with an armada of over 300 ships and 40,000 soldiers. He swept into Alexandria, claiming Egypt for France. The French army marched inland, winning victories against the Mamluks, establishing a foothold in this ancient land. But Napoleon's dreams carried one fatal flaw. To hold Egypt, he needed control of the sea, and on the Mediterranean there was only one master: Britain. The man standing in Napoleon's way was Admiral Horatio Nelson, a one-eyed, battle-scarred warrior of the sea. At 40 years old, Nelson was no stranger to naval warfare. He had fought the French and Spanish in countless engagements. He had lost the sight in his right eye, nearly lost his arm, but never his will. When word reached Britain that Napoleon's fleet had vanished into the Mediterranean, Nelson was dispatched like a hound unleashed. For weeks he scoured the sea, searching for the French. Storms battered his ships, supplies dwindled, but Nelson never wavered. His mission was clear: find the French, destroy it. At last, in late July, Nelson's patience was rewarded. French ships had been sighted anchored in Aboukir Bay near Alexandria. The French Navy, under Admiral François-Paul Brillat des Galliers, had chosen to anchor close to the shore, forming a defensive line. Their ships bristled with cannons, confident that shallow waters would protect them from attack. But Nelson was not a man easily deterred. As night fell on August 1st, the French fleet rested at anchor. Brillat believed his position unassailable. His ships were massive. The flagship L'Orient, a behemoth of 120 guns, was one of the largest vessels afloat. Around it, 13 ships of the line and 4 frigates stood ready. The French sailors drank and sang and mocked the idea of a British assault. After all, who would dare attack at night in shallow waters filled with hidden shoals? But across the bay, Nelson had already made his decision. He studied the French line, saw its flaw, and prepared to strike. At 6 p.m., as the golden light of sunset bathed the horizon, Nelson raised his signal flags. The order was simple, ruthless, unforgettable. Engage the enemy closely. British ships surged forward, sails straining in the evening breeze. The French looked on in disbelief. Were the British really charging headlong into their line? Yes, but Nelson had a plan no Frenchman had anticipated. Instead of attacking from the seaward side alone, British ships slipped between the French fleet and the shoreline. Like wolves circling their prey, they struck from both flanks, surrounding the French. The first clash came at dusk. Cannon fire split the night. Thunder roared across the bay as British broadsides tore into French hulls. Smoke and flame engulfed the decks. Men screamed, splinters flew like daggers, and the tranquil waters turned red with blood. By 7 p.m., the bay was a furnace of destruction. Amid the chaos, Nelson himself stood on the deck of his flagship, the HMS Vanguard. Cannon blasts lit his face in flashes of fire. Orders barked, signals flown, guns reloaded. The battle moved with relentless fury. At one point, a piece of shrapnel struck Nelson's forehead, opening a deep wound. Blood streamed down his face, blinding him. Officers rushed forward in panic, but Nelson refused to leave. He wrapped the wound, steadied himself, and continued commanding. His resolve electrified his men. To them, Nelson was more than an admiral. He was a force of nature. As darkness swallowed the bay, the battle reached a fever pitch. French ships fought valiantly, but their line was collapsing. British broadsides crashed again and again, shredding sails, splintering masts, igniting decks. One by one, French vessels began to fall silent, their guns smashed, their crews overwhelmed. But at the center of the French line, one ship still loomed, defiant and terrible: l'Orient. The pride of France, a floating fortress, 120 guns, crewed by nearly 1,000 men. She dwarfed every ship in the bay. If l'Orient held, the French might yet turn the tide. But fate had other plans. British ships converged on l'Orient, unleashing a storm of cannon fire. Shot after shot crashed into her hull. Flames licked across her decks, feeding on tar, wood, and canvas. Her crew scrambled desperately, dousing the inferno, but the fire spread faster than they could contain. By 10 p.m., the mighty l'Orient was a blazing torch on the water. Her golden decorations melted. Her cannons overheated and exploded in their own housings. The sky turned orange with the fury of her destruction. Then came the moment etched into history. At 10:30 p.m., the fire reached her powder magazine. For a brief instant, the world held its breath. And then, the night erupted. A cataclysmic explosion tore through the bay. The blast was so powerful, it shattered windows miles away in Alexandria. A mushroom cloud of fire and debris shot into the heavens. Burning timbers rained down into the sea. L'Orient, the pride of France, was gone. The shock of l'Orient's destruction rippled through the French fleet. Sailors froze in terror. Officers faltered. The will of the French Navy cracked under the weight of the catastrophe. As midnight approached, the outcome of the battle was sealed, but the slaughter was not yet over. The night was long, and Nelson's vengeance had only begun. The Battle of the Nile had reached its turning point, but the echoes of that night would thunder across history. Midnight in Aboukir Bay. The sea itself seemed stunned. Where once the colossal l'Orient had towered above the waves, now only wreckage smoldered on the tide. Bodies floated lifelessly. Timbers still ablaze crackled on the water, and the air was thick with smoke and ash. The French sailors who survived the inferno clung to debris, their screams echoing through the night. Some British boats rowed into the hellscape, pulling survivors from the water. Even amid the brutality of war, there was humanity. Nelson himself ordered mercy. Any Frenchman who could be saved from the burning wreckage would be spared. But for the French Navy, mercy could not change reality. With the destruction of l'Orient, the heart of their fleet had been ripped out, their morale shattered, their command silenced, their fate sealed. Yet the night was far from quiet. Beyond the burning ruin of l'Orient, the battle raged on. Cannon fire still roared, musket balls cracked, and men fought desperately on blood-slicked decks.
The French ships on the van, the lead of their line, had already been hammered into submission by the British vanguard. Now Nelson's ships turned their fury toward the center and rear of the French line. Ship after ship endured a storm of shot and shell. The Franklin, the Tonnant, the Spartiate, each was battered mercilessly. Masts snapped, decks split, men were thrown into the sea. But despite the chaos, French sailors fought with grim determination. They knew retreat was impossible. Anchored in Aboukir Bay, they had no escape. Their only choice was to fight or to die. Imagine the scene.
A British frigate alongside a French giant, their cannons thundering at near point-blank range. Flames leaping across rigging. Gun crews stripped to the waist, their bodies slick with sweat and blood, dragging cannons back into position with ropes and brute strength. Each broadside was a gamble. Would the next volley tear through the enemy or explode your own gun deck? Above the din, captains barked orders, their voices almost drowned in the fury. Powder boys, some as young as 12, sprinted back and forth with cartridges, their small bodies lit by the orange glow of firelight. This was not strategy now. This was survival. On board HMS Vanguard, Admiral Nelson remained at the center of command, despite his bleeding wound. His bandaged head throbbed, but his eyes never left the chaos unfolding before him. His officers awaited orders, but Nelson's commands came swift, precise, and unwavering. Press them. Do not let them breathe. His philosophy was simple, overwhelming aggression. Where other commanders might hesitate, Nelson struck with relentless force. He understood that in naval warfare, morale was as decisive as firepower. Break the spirit of the enemy, and victory would follow. By 2 a.m., that spirit was nearly gone. When dawn broke over Aboukir Bay on August 2nd, the full scale of the disaster was revealed. Smoke still hung in the air, veiling the wreckage like a funeral shroud. The bay, once orderly with proud French ships, was now a graveyard. Of the 13 French ships of the line, 9 had been captured or destroyed. 2 had run aground and were ablaze. Only 2 managed to escape, the Guillaume Tell and the Généreux, slipping away under cover of darkness. The rest were gone. The French Navy in the Mediterranean was annihilated. Napoleon's army, stranded deep in Egypt, was cut off from France. Supplies, reinforcements, and retreat all severed. For the French soldiers on land, the Nile had become a prison. News of the disaster traveled quickly. When word reached Napoleon in Cairo, he was stunned. His dreams of using Egypt as a springboard to threaten India were shattered overnight. "Our navy is lost," he admitted grimly. The army that had marched so triumphantly into Egypt was now trapped, hemmed in by desert and sea, forced to survive on whatever resources they could wrest from the land. Napoleon's men would endure years of hardship, disease, and desperation before being evacuated. The general's reputation survived, but his grand strategy was undone. And in the shadows of this defeat, the legend of Horatio Nelson was born. Back in Britain, the news of Nelson's victory ignited a wave of national pride. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and Nelson's name became synonymous with glory. In the words of Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, "England has saved herself by her exertions and will, as I trust, save Europe by her example." Nelson's tactics at the Nile were hailed as genius. He had taken a risky, unconventional strategy and turned it into one of the most decisive naval victories in history. For Nelson, the victory was personal as well as national. He had gambled everything on this battle, and it had paid off. Yet his body bore the cost. His wounds never fully healed, and the pain remained a constant companion. Still, his spirit only grew stronger. The Battle of the Nile had made him a hero. The coming wars
would make him a legend. The destruction of the French fleet at the Nile did more than isolate Napoleon. It reshaped the balance of power across Europe. Britain's dominance at sea was now undeniable. The Mediterranean, once contested, fell firmly under British control. Trade routes reopened, allies were emboldened, and France, despite its armies sweeping across the continent, found itself checked by the unyielding power of the Royal Navy. For Napoleon, the Egyptian expedition transformed from a grand conquest into a slow humiliation. His scientists made discoveries, his soldiers won battles, but without ships, without the sea, his empire in Egypt was doomed. The Nile was not just a naval battle, it was a turning point in the great struggle between Britain and France.
But victory came at a cost. The waters of Aboukir Bay held not just wreckage, but thousands of bodies. The cries of the wounded echoed long after the guns fell silent. For every triumph, there was sacrifice. British sailors who had fought bravely were buried at sea, their comrades watching in silence as their bodies slipped beneath the waves. French families waited in vain for sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return. The Nile was glorious in victory, but brutal in reality. In the years to come, Nelson's victory at the Nile would be remembered as one of the greatest in naval history. Paintings captured the fiery destruction of Lorient. Ballads were sung of Nelson's courage. And for the British people, the battle became a symbol of resilience, proof that no matter how great the threat, the Royal Navy would stand unbroken. For Nelson himself, the Nile was only the beginning. Ahead lay Copenhagen, and ultimately Trafalgar. But in Aboukir Bay, amid the smoke and fire, the legend had begun. The Battle of the Nile was more than a clash of fleets. It was the collision of empires. In one night, Napoleon's vision of Eastern conquest was crippled, and Britain's path to maritime supremacy was secured. The echoes of that night, of fire, of thunder, of the great explosion of Lorient, would resound through history. And from those waters rose the immortal figure of Horatio Nelson. The thunder of Aboukir Bay did not end with the explosion of Lorient. Its echoes carried across the Mediterranean, across Europe, across the very halls of power where kings and ministers weighed the fate of nations. The Battle of the Nile was not merely a naval victory. It was a message, written in fire and smoke, that Britain still reigned supreme upon the waves. When news reached Paris, the shock was profound. The French government had celebrated Napoleon's expedition into Egypt as a stroke of genius, a bold thrust that would cripple Britain's empire. Now, with the French fleet annihilated, those same ministers faced humiliation. The Mediterranean, once a stage for French ambition, belonged to Britain once more. Napoleon himself, still in Cairo, received the grim tidings with a cold fury. He masked his despair before his men, but in private he admitted the truth. Our navy is gone. We are isolated in this land. The conquest of Egypt had been swift, but without control of the sea, it was meaningless. Supplies grew scarce, communications with France were severed, reinforcements could never come. The French army, triumphant on land, was now a stranded host in a hostile desert. His dream of marching east, of challenging Britain in India, collapsed overnight. In London, by contrast, jubilation erupted. When news of Nelson's victory arrived, church bells pealed across the city, cannons fired in salute, and crowds filled the streets in celebration. The newspapers proclaimed Nelson the savior of Britain.
He was hailed not just as a naval commander, but as a national hero, the embodiment of courage and defiance. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger declared that Britain had achieved not only a military victory, but a moral one. The world had witnessed the indomitable spirit of the Royal Navy. Nelson himself returned to Britain a wounded but exalted man. His head still bore the scar from Aboukir Bay, but his fame was untarnished. Everywhere he went, crowds gathered to cheer. Women sent him letters of admiration. Painters immortalized him on canvas. But the myth of Nelson was not merely built on victory, it was built on his daring. He had broken the conventions of naval warfare, striking at night in shallow waters, splitting the enemy line from both sides. His willingness to gamble everything, to risk annihilation for the chance of total victory, captured the imagination of his people. Nelson was no longer just an admiral. He was a legend in the making. The ripple effects of the Battle of the Nile reached far beyond Britain and France. Across Europe, nations long oppressed by French might took courage. The Ottoman Empire, humiliated by Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, rallied under British protection. The Russians, eager to curb French influence, began to stir. A new coalition against France began to form, encouraged by Britain's resurgence. What had begun as a single battle in a distant bay now reshaped the entire balance of Europe. The Revolutionary Wars, once tilting in France's favor, began to shift.
Meanwhile, in Egypt, Napoleon fought desperately to salvage his campaign. His soldiers endured the unforgiving desert sun, diseases, and relentless attacks from Ottoman forces and local resistance. Napoleon attempted to win the hearts of the Egyptians, presenting himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He studied their culture, even bringing scholars to record the wonders of ancient Egypt. It was during this campaign that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, unlocking the secrets of hieroglyphs centuries later. But no discovery could alter the reality. Without the sea, the French army was a ghost, wandering in exile. For Napoleon, the most bitter truth was this: his brilliance on land had been undone by one man at sea. Wherever Napoleon's name was spoken, Nelson's followed. The general and the admiral, bound by destiny, though separated by nations and oceans. Nelson had humiliated him in Egypt, and in time their paths would cross again, indirectly, in the long war that would culminate at Trafalgar. But in 1798, Napoleon's fury burned. He dreamed of revenge, but revenge would have to wait. Though celebrated as a hero, Nelson was no stranger to suffering. His head wound from the Nile throbbed endlessly. He had already lost an eye, nearly lost an arm, and carried the scars of countless battles. Yet he pressed on. To his men, his resilience was inspiring. He was proof that devotion to duty came before self. To his enemies, he was relentless. To his nation, he was irreplaceable. The Nile had not broken him, it had only hardened his resolve. With the French fleet destroyed, Britain tightened its grip on the Mediterranean. Convoys sailed unchallenged. Ports once threatened by French dominance now opened their gates to British ships. For the first time in years, Britain could breathe freely. The Channel remained threatened, but the wider seas, the arteries of empire, flowed under the protection of the Royal Navy. The lesson was clear. Armies may march across continents, but without control of the seas, empires crumble. The explosion of Lorient was the defining image of the battle. Witnesses described it as a second sun, a pillar of fire reaching into the heavens. For sailors, it was both terror and awe. For artists and poets, it was inspiration. Paintings depicted the burning ship as a divine act,
a punishment of hubris. Writers compared it to the fall of Icarus, consumed by his own ambition. And for Britain, it became a symbol, the moment when French pride was shattered and British dominance was set ablaze in glory. Yet despite victory, the war was far from over. France still held vast armies in Europe. Napoleon still dreamed of conquest. The revolution's fire still burned. But at sea, Britain had proven that no matter how bold France's plans, they could be broken. The Nile was not the final word, but it was a turning point. The struggle between Britain and France would continue for years, through countless battles, until it reached its final crescendo at Trafalgar. The Battle of the Nile was not only a triumph of ships and guns, it was the triumph of will, of daring, of a nation's spirit embodied in one man, Horatio Nelson. For Napoleon, it was a lesson carved in fire, that ambition, no matter how great, could be undone in a single night. For Britain, it was the dawn of a new age of supremacy at sea. But for the world, it was a reminder. History turns not only on the clash of armies, but on the fury of the waves. Long after the smoke cleared, the waters of Aboukir Bay whispered of the night when fire consumed the sea. The shattered masts, the silent cannons, the blackened bones of Lorient resting on the seabed, all told the same story. A single battle can change the course of history. The Nile was not just a battle won. It was a prophecy of the struggles to come. Nelson's triumph reshaped the map of power, while Napoleon's eastern dream drowned in the very waters that were meant to carry him to glory. Though stranded, Napoleon pressed on for a time. His army marched into Syria, winning at Jaffa and Acre, but disease and attrition devoured his strength. Without naval support, every mile further from Cairo felt like a march into exile.
The Battle of the Nile was not the end of the struggle between Britain and France, but it was the moment the tide turned. From that night forward, the sea belonged to Britain, and with the sea, the future. As the sun sets on Aboukir Bay today, the waters ripple over the graves of men who fought more than 2 centuries ago. Beneath the waves lie the remains of ships, cannons, and dreams. But the echoes of that night endure. In every history book, in every monument, in every whispered tale of Nelson's daring, the Battle of the Nile lives on. It was a night of fire and thunder, a night of heroes and tragedy, a night that changed the world.